Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, we're going to react to details from the Challenger disaster that will chill you to the bone. I mean, just looking at what happened, that's enough to chill me to the bone. You know, I think it's 5 astronauts, including a teacher, watched around the world, like being streamed around the world. You know, the teacher's classroom, the whole school watching from not too far away. And then it just exploding. It's just seeing that you're never going to forget that. I would never forget that. Just to know that there's 5 human beings in that rocket that have just been, it's just mad. And to think that, because I think it was an O-ring, it was the O-ring, like there was a leak, it wasn't secure enough. So I think some of the fuel was going where it shouldn't, like, and all they had to do was just add another O-ring. But like, I remember watching a video and they said it wouldn't even have cost that much. You know, I think it went to court. Yeah, I think people were punished for it, rightly so. I think it was because they didn't want to delay the launch or something like that. But yeah, it's always fun or interesting, I'll say, to learn about the Challenger disaster because, you know, so many lessons, important lessons were learned from it.
On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger took to the skies for a brief 73 seconds before a fiery demise. Here's what happened minute by minute. Leading up to the Challenger disaster, most people thought it perfectly reasonable to think of the space shuttle like an airplane, reusable, reliable, comfortable, and safe.
I think it's going to be very exciting for kids to be able to turn on the TV and see that space is for everybody.
But there was a massive problem with risk analysis. A 3-volume study, first published in 1979, estimated that the chances of a shuttle breaking up on launch, exactly like Challenger did, were between 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 10,000. The weakest point? Solid fuel rocket boosters. Fast forward to 1983, and another study suggested the risk of a shuttle breakup was closer to 1 in 100. After the Challenger disaster, physicist Richard P. Feynman explained, the higher figures, 1 in 100, come from working engineers, and the very low figures, 1 in 100,000, from management.
I mean, in this situation, you go with the engineers. Like management, I'm sure they probably know something about space travel, but you go with the people actually building and designing the rockets.
The Challenger accident resulted in the establishment of a program that would collect data, including flight and test data, for risk assessment, which was something new. Before the tragedy, NASA didn't think it was necessary, and that kind of explains how certain egregious oversights occurred. Prep for Challenger's launch was a months-long process that began in 1984 and included 37 weeks of crew training. In fact, the date of the disaster wasn't the original launch date. After a flight readiness review on January 15th, launch times and dates were changed multiple times to account for the possibilities of aborted landings and the best time to view Halley's Comet, which, along with deploying the Spartan satellites, was a big part of Challenger's mission. The mission date was pushed back several times, and NASA eventually landed on a launch date of January 22, 1986. The story gets more complicated as delays plagued the mission in the days leading up to its eventual launch. That particular January was exceptionally cold, and with temperatures dropping well below freezing, it was clear that Challenger would be launching in temperatures that no shuttle had ever launched in before.
Even though we understood that we could have a catastrophic failure, NASA wanted to have increased number of launches.
Launch was pushed back from the 26th to the 27th because of weather concerns, and on the 27th, Challenger got very close to leaving the launch pad. The Challenger crew was ready on the morning of January 27th.
Man, there was 7 of them. Oh, dang. Yeah, and obviously each of these people, like, to get onto a spaceship, effectively, you know, these people are super smart. Like, it was a big loss.
And according to NASA records, everything was going according to plan. Shuttle preparations began at 12:30 a.m., and after waking up at 5:07 a.m., the crew was strapped into their assigned positions in the shuttle at 7:56 a.m. About an hour later, Challenger's crew alerted control to a door ajar signal. The problem was with an exterior hatch. After the ground crew secured the door, they couldn't remove the exterior handle. The screws that held it in place were frozen. Over the course of 2 hours, ground crews struggled to remove the hatch handle with screwdrivers, a drill, and a hacksaw. And by the time they finally managed to get it off, the crew had been sitting in place for 5 hours and the launch window had passed.
I thought, gee, this is more like watching a rerun of the Three Stooges than launching a space shuttle.
Kennedy Shuttle Chief Bob Seek issued a statement saying, "It was just not our day. Our plan is to recycle and go for Tuesday morning." The Challenger disaster came very close to not happening, And if it had been up to engineers from Morton Thiokol, it wouldn't have. Morton Thiokol is the company that made the O-rings that were ultimately blamed for the accident. On January 27th at around 1 p.m., NASA reached out to Thiokol to ask whether the cold could cause problems. Management spoke among themselves, convened with engineers by 2:30 p.m., and at 5:45 they conferenced with NASA to recommend scrubbing the launch. After more discussion, another conference was called for 8:45 p.m. Engineer Roger Bougele argued that the O-rings weren't designed to function in the kind of freezing weather Florida had been experiencing.
There was not one positive statement for launch ever made in that room.
Simply put, the O-ring is a rubber gasket that seals in hot gases produced during solid fuel launches. When the rubber gets too cold, it's not flexible enough to seal completely, and launching with improperly set O-rings could mean leakage and ultimately disaster. On the basis of engineer recommendations, Thiokol heads stated that no launch should be undertaken in temperatures below previously tested conditions of 53 degrees Fahrenheit. That was their stance until 10:30 p.m. Arguments over the safety concerns created by the temperature were going nowhere when contractor Morton Thiokol and NASA ended their conference to discuss matters further and reconvene. When they did, it was to make recommendations that would doom the Challenger and crew. The teleconference picked up again at 11 p.m. Bougele would later explain, "It is hard to understand how those at NASA and Marshall could have thought the Challenger flight ready unless they presumed that unless the engineers could show that the flight would fail, then it would succeed."
Ridiculous. So what, you need to see it blow up? Like, that you're basically saying that as long as it doesn't blow up, anything else is fine. Let's just, come on. Like, if it was an unmanned mission, then I can understand taking that attitude. But there's people on there. Like, would you go on there? You know, the person making this decision, would you go on there, risk your life like that?
In other words, Thiokol engineers couldn't show concrete proof that the O-rings were going to fail, so it was decided that they would be fine.
If you don't keep your schedule, you don't keep your budget. So I put the pressure on myself, just as a matter of pride.
Executives at Thiokol faxed over their signed affidavit that the Challenger was all right to launch at 11:45 p.m., even as some at NASA continued to argue that the launch wasn't a good idea. January 28th, launch day. Overnight temperatures had once again been well below freezing, and at 1:35 a.m., crews were dispatched to the launch site to decide whether or not ice was going to be a problem. At the same time, hardware issues with the ground liquid hydrogen storage tank were discovered, which set fueling time back. At 3 a.m., inspection teams submitted their report for consideration, and the countdown continued. That delay, however, pushed things back a bit. The crew was scheduled for a wake-up at 6:18, but they were all reportedly awake as debate over the mission continued. As early as 5 a.m., there was another discussion about O-rings, but it wasn't even mentioned at the 9 a.m. meeting to discuss the findings of a second inspection of the launch site. When that had started at 7 a.m., ice and cold temperatures were still a major concern, but the launch remained on track.
A lot of people had this gut feeling that this just doesn't feel right.
The Challenger's launch
Then why didn't you stop it? Like, if you really had that gut feeling, I'm sure you could have found a way to stop it. You know, talk is cheap.
delay meant that the crew had extra time to prepare. According to NASA reports, they took their time over breakfast. And while they were briefed on things like weather conditions and temperature, there's a horrible little footnote buried in the official logs reading, "Neither then nor in earlier weather discussions was the crew told of any concern about the effects of low temperature on the shuttle system."
How could they live with themselves for making a decision like that?
The media was there, including CBS radio news reporter Frank Motek. A year after the disaster, he recalled watching the crew get ready, saying, "We watched the crew members gather together for breakfast, take their trip to the launch pad, put on their spacesuits, and board their spaceship. We saw Krista McAuliffe smile as the technician gave her an apple." The crew arrived at the launch pad at 8:03. 33 minutes later, they were strapped in and ready to go. 8 minutes later, another ice inspection resulted in another delay, with yet another ice inspection wrapping up at 11:15. Then it was go time. Launch began at 11:38 a.m. At minus 6.6 seconds, the engines ignited, and the solid rocket boosters ignited as the countdown hit 0. 7 seconds later, a roll program was heard from the Challenger flight deck. Houston replied, "Roll, Challenger." At 65 seconds, Houston gave another instruction to the shuttle crew.
"Challenger, go at throttle up." "Roger, go at throttle up."
Then, 73 seconds after the countdown had reached 0, signal was lost. NASA maintains that everything was normal. Processes and procedures were going as planned, there were no alarms or warnings, and then suddenly there was nothing. On the ground were about 500 people, including neighbors of shuttle pilot Michael J. Smith and friends of Krista McAuliffe. From their point of view, things happened almost instantaneously. By the time the sound of liftoff reached them, they saw the flash burn in the fiery clouds. Eerily, NASA has stated that the first indication they had that things were terribly wrong was the same moment etched into the memories of countless students watching the launch in their schools via satellite link, the moment the shuttle began to break apart.
Flight GC, we've had negative contact, lost downlink.
Challenger launched from Cape Canaveral, Florida, under the watchful eye of Houston's Mission Control. While it took just 73 seconds for the Challenger mission to go terribly wrong, the New York Times reported that in the minutes following the disaster, Mission Control continued to report that everything was fine. In fact, 105 seconds after launch, Public Affairs Officer Stephen A. Nesbitt was still tracking Challenger on radar, only he wasn't.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
That July,
can you imagine, like, the person or the people who sanctioned the mission, despite having all of the information, the managers at Morton Thiokol, like, can you imagine the cold dread when they saw it explode? Because they would have been watching it. Like, can you imagine how they must have felt in that moment when they knew that they had just lost 7 people their lives because they wouldn't just delay a space mission? Like, they must have known, I'm in trouble. I'm in big trouble.
It was widely reported that NASA had released evidence that suggested the crew was at least briefly aware of things going wrong. They had recorded the activation of 3 emergency packs and released the last recorded voice. Pilot Michael J. Smith could be heard saying, "uh-oh," at the 73-second mark. NASA was never the same after the Challenger disaster. Almost immediately, experts were sent scrambling to figure out what happened and why it was someone else's fault. One of the experts they called in, who only reluctantly agreed to be part of the investigation, was physicist Richard Feynman, who had previously worked on the Manhattan Project, diagrammed the interaction between light and matter, and won a Nobel Prize.
I personally doubt that they're touching the face of God, so I prefer to show my respect by finding the cause of their appalling deaths and not stand around looking sad.
Feynman was promised NASA's full cooperation, but he would later write that the whole process was, quote, in reality, sitting around doing nothing most of the time. So he took matters into his own hands, headed to NASA headquarters, and instead of chatting with NASA management, he spoke with engineers before he was barred from the building. He'd already caught wind.
Why on earth didn't they just let him speak to the engineers in the first place? Like, it's surprising, because NASA, you think that even the managers would be geniuses, that they would know exactly what to do, you know.
Ended the dispute over the O-rings, and then he took part in the Rogers Commission hearings. There were 2 important moments. One was Feynman's demonstration, with the help of pliers, a clamp, an O-ring, and some ice water, of how rigid, inflexible, and ready to leak O-rings became when subjected to cold temperatures.
There's no resilience in this particular material when it's at a temperature of 32 degrees.
The other was 7 words from Morton Thiokol rocket booster director Alan McDonald, who, after NASA denied they were aware of problems, stood up to say, "Mr. Chairman, we recommended not to launch." In April 1986, NASA announced that recovery operations were finished, most of the shuttle had been recovered, and the remains of all 7 astronauts had been retrieved. Operations had focused on an area 17 miles off the coast of Florida. They added, "Final forensic work and future planning in accordance with family desires will be completed within the next several days and will be announced when appropriate."
It was in fairly shallow water. The crew members are there, inside this intact compartment.
Descriptions of the scene were pretty awful, with the wreckage described as little more than a pile of rubble on the ocean floor, 8 feet high and 50 feet across. The astronauts' remains were crushed inside the debris and could not be recognized as human. Not all pieces of the Challenger had been recovered, though. In 1996, 2 pieces, parts of the left inboard wing flap, washed ashore at Florida's Cocoa Beach. They weren't small pieces either. One 8 by 14 foot piece required heavy machinery to move it. Then, fast forward to 2022, divers looking for a World War II-era rescue plane and filming for a History Channel special about the Bermuda Triangle found a 20-foot-long piece of Challenger. They turned their findings over to NASA, who issued a statement that read in part, "This discovery gives us an opportunity to pause once again to uplift the legacies of the 7 pioneers we lost and to reflect on how this tragedy changed us."
I think my philosophy of living is to get as much out of life as possible.
Oh, man. Wow, man, it's just it really it's a sad story. It's a sad story about how, you know, negligence, impatience can just really cost you. Like, sometimes it reminds me of those people who blow through a red light you know, only to then get pulled over by the cops or crash your car. It's like, for the sake of, in the grand scheme of things, what? Just a few moments, you know, not much. You've now cost yourself something much bigger. Like you've lost your car or you've lost your license. You know, it's the same principle. Obviously, hindsight's 20/20 because potentially the launch could have gone well, and then everybody would be saying that the managers at Morton Thiokol and at NASA were geniuses. They did the right thing. They didn't need to delay it, you know. But when it goes wrong, when it goes south, that's when there's a price to pay. And, you know, even though some of the managers at NASA and Morton Thiokol, you know, paid a price, you know, they maybe lost their careers, their reputations were massively stained. Ultimately, you know, the astronauts who are completely innocent in all this paid the biggest one. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.